Hello, everybody. I'm JP Walsh, the director of the Coastal Resources Center and a professor in the Graduate School of Oceanography at the University of Rhode Island. On behalf of the organizing committee, I want to offer a warm welcome to our first session of the Global Ocean Series. Thanks all of you for joining, as well as the guest speakers, my co-organizers, and supporting entities. Please see the Global Ocean Series website for speaker bios, partner details, future events, and other information. Many of you know that our in-person event scheduled for the spring at URI was canceled, but we felt it was important to advance this conversation about the ocean decade for sustainable development, and specifically to talk about linkages between local science and management, such as the work being done by many organizations, universities, and other researchers, and efforts addressing larger ocean scales, in particular the successful work on large marine ecosystems. So in short, there have been successes at many scales, and we need to build upon those and bridge between local and large marine ecosystem actions. Before getting into the program, I want to provide a few logistical points. First, the event is being recorded, and we plan to make the video available publicly after the event. For those not familiar with WebEx, your view of the speakers and the slides can be adjusted using a button in the top right of your WebEx window. If you click in the window, you can toggle between a mosaic of the videos of the people with videos on, or other views. For comments, so one of the important things that we are going to be working on is using the chat. So if you want to make comments or to either the host or the panelists, please use the chat. Sarah Gaines from the Coastal Resources Center and I will be monitoring. Please take a moment now to introduce yourself on the chat by giving your name, affiliation, location to the panelists and hosts. And at the end of the program, we plan to have time for several questions from the audience. To submit questions, please use the Q&A tool. Okay, so if you look at the toolbar, I think it's off to the right, there's a place where you can enter in questions. And please indicate if you want to ask your question directly out loud, or otherwise a facilitator will read the question. Now, before turning it over to Barry, I want to remind everyone of the goals of the series. The first, to better understand the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Ocean Decade Objectives, and connections to work being done by scientists, organizations, communities, and countries. The second is to share science and management efforts, especially those that link across scales, from large marine ecosystems, or what we often call LMEs for short, to local actions. And then the third, discuss and identify how to improve efforts and linkages immediately and then over the decade. To chair this session today, I would now like to introduce Barry Gold, principal at Earth Resilience Group. Barry.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everybody. John, I'm not seeing the...
Oh, your slide, sorry. Maybe if you could go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm Barry Gold, be chairing the session. I've, until recently, was the head of the environment program for the Walton Family Foundation. And just let me give you an outline of how we're going to run the session this morning. As John said, the speakers will each make brief introductory statements. Then we'll have questions from myself or John with discussion amongst the panelists. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Can you see that?
All good.
I'd like to start by providing a few framing remarks. As John said, the bios are online, so I'm going to provide some brief framing remarks, and then I will introduce the panelists. Each panelist will have 5 minutes. We'll go into Q&A amongst the panelists and then open it up for broader Q&A with the audience, and then we'll have a little bit of closing remarks. As those of you on this webinar know, ocean ecosystems have been changing over the course of human history, and much of that change has been accelerating over the last 50 to 100 years. Just last month, a paper in Nature by Duarte et al. Documented these changes, as well as regulatory progress and increasing threats. We also know that many species, including humans, dependency on healthy oceans require that we address these changes in a meaningful way. We need an approach to management that can maintain the integrity of essential ecosystem structure and function while accommodating necessary development and other activity. In 1984, a little more than 35 years ago, Ken Sherman and Lou Alexander convened the first symposium on large marine ecosystems. It explored scientific observations about the range of natural variability in LMEs and evidence that human-mediated changes from overfishing to pollution were driving change in marine ecosystems outside the range of natural variability. In 1986, I had the privilege to work with Ken and Lou to help shape a second LME symposium, which took a deeper focus on LMEs as appropriate management units. LMEs represented a simple yet radical new idea at the time. The idea of looking at ocean management from the perspective of ecological boundaries rather than artificial, political, or administrative boundaries. Today, human uses of the ocean have exploded. They range from aquaculture to coastal development to artisanal, commercial, and recreational fishing to mining, oil and gas extraction, renewable energy generation, shipping, tourism and recreation, national security, and more recently, CO2 sequestration. Many of these uses and their impacts or benefits transcend jurisdictional boundaries. Even the high seas, long considered the last wild frontier, has now become the latest frontier for exploitation with almost no thought about appropriate oversight or management. At the same time, we've seen an explosion in our scientific understanding and a growth in approaches to managing human uses, ranging from sector-specific regulation to the role of markets, to ecosystem-based management as a strategy for balancing trade-offs among social and ecological considerations. If we're going to secure the ocean health that's needed in the coming decades, we need to find a way to bring these different approaches together, to harmonize the different brands, regulations, performance standards, market-driven demand, whether it's MPAs, MSP, CZM, marine ecosystem-based management, et cetera, and apply them as stacked interventions at ecosystem and oceanic scales. Similar to the introduction of LMEs as a new idea some 35 years ago, we need to embrace the idea that securing ocean health will require an approach that balances continued economic development of ocean areas with preservation of the natural marine ecosystems we depend on. It will require collective action where industry, local communities, NGOs, governments, and academics roll up their sleeves and together address the challenges of an increasingly crowded ocean, where there is recognition and wide agreement that a healthy ocean is in the benefit of everyone's interests, whether they are economic, recreational, or ecological. Building on the LME spatial management approach, as the Jeff is doing, has such potential. Whatever you call it, we need an integrated and holistic process that can transform the way we manage and preserve our oceans. I gave a similar talk to this in 2013. At that time, I posed the question, what if 30% of the world's exclusive economic zones were sustainably managed in the next 10 years? It seemed ambitious at the time. We now know it's insufficient. Duarte et al. Paper I referenced earlier lays out a roadmap to recovery of marine life by 2050. Recovery is possible, but only through the integration of multiple approaches to marine management and meaningfully addressing climate change. So let's set our sights higher and work together to ensure at least 30% of the ocean is conserved and 100% is sustainably managed in the next 10 years. Now, let me introduce the speakers. We have Peter Thompson, UN Secretary General Special Envoy for the Oceans, Vladimir Rybinin, Executive Secretary IOC and Assistant Director UNESCO, who's also joined by Julian Barbier, Sandra Whitehouse, Senior Policy Advisor at Ocean Conservancy, Elin Torell, Director of International Programs at the Coastal Resources Center at URI, and hopefully Ken Sherman, who is the godfather of LMEs, former NOAA and now also at URI. With that, let me turn it over to Peter for some remarks. Peter?
Great. Can you hear me, Barry?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'll just put on my timer here. You've asked me to speak for 5 minutes. First of all, just say thank you for the invitation, and thank you to everybody who's participating. Because, easy for the ocean to slip off the agenda during these times when everybody's concerned about this pandemic. But I'll say a few things as to why we should not be allowed to slip off the table. And congratulations to you guys for doing your bit in keeping us on the table. So to all those listening in, I take it that you are ocean activists just by your participation in this. So I want to thank you too. And good to see some old colleagues of mine on the panel with us today, and that they're contributing as well. Look, you all know that the UN Ocean Conference has been postponed. It was to have been held in the first week of June. But it's no more than that. It's no more than a postponement. In fact, I was on the phone yesterday to the Portuguese government. It's too early for them to suggest a date. Obviously, they're still coming out of their pandemic management, but they are 100% determined to make this a vibrant conference in Lisbon once we've got the dates set up. So, we all need to be doing our bit in the meantime in terms of keeping the momentum going, doing the necessary, because that moment of reality is going to come in Lisbon before we know it, and we have all got work to do. One of the things that we've done to fill that gap that is left in the first week of June is to organize through the World Economic Forum and the Friends of Ocean Action these virtual ocean dialogues that are being held from the 1st to the 5th of June. And I do encourage all of you just to, if you go to your search engine and just put in virtual ocean dialogues, you'll get all the information there about how to register. And for whether you're interested in LMEs or any other aspect of SDG 14, you'll find space there for you to be getting involved and listening to the best of world expertise. This is high level. There are over half a dozen heads of government speaking at this, but the high levels of expertise on panels and all the rest. So I encourage you to participate in that. I was also speaking yesterday to the president of the BB&J conference. Of course, as most of you would know, in terms of ocean governance, that all-important 4th conference was coming up for BB&J, and that had to be postponed as well. At the moment, they've got a slot for August, but if that doesn't eventuate because of the self-isolating problems we're all facing, January is the next most likely, I would say, for the BB&J conference. And you all know how important that is in terms of some of the things that Barry's already been talking about there, but in terms of governance of the high seas, that having a solid BB&J document coming out of that 4th conference is absolutely essential. I'm 3 minutes into it, and I got a lot that I want to contribute to this gathering today. I'm conscious that we've got a second round on this, and I know that Vladimir is going to be talking about the UN Decade of Ocean Science, so I won't mention that. But I do want to say to you that, those of you who might be feeling a bit despondent, and I'm sure all of us have had bouts of that during our self-isolation, I do want to let you know that the momentum is there. It's incredible the amount of work being done around the world on behalf of SDG 14. So don't give up at all on this stuff. And I include on that things like, the specifics like SDG 14.5, for MPAs. There's good news coming in all the time on that, and we're putting a lot of pressure on CAMLA to deliver in October those 3 big MPAs in the southern. I could actually get to 4.5 by the end of the year. Likewise, SDG 14.6 on the harmful fisheries subsidies. I think we can get there. And again, we're putting a lot of pressure on the ambassadors in Geneva who are negotiating that agreement, which hopefully will be adopted at the WTO General Council in December. So what I'm saying to you all is whatever you were doing before in a positive light, double down on it, because there is opportunity in crisis. And look, that's my 5 minutes up, so I'll pass it over to the others now, but look forward to further contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was great. Vladimir, welcome your comments.
Thank you very much, Barry. I hope very much that Ken Sherman will join us by telephone. But even if he doesn't do it, we have to, I think, start by thanking him for what he did and all his team at the beginning of the 90s, because they gave us a handle. It is very difficult to manage the ocean, and you have to find something that is manageable. And the approach to large marine ecosystem explains a lot. I'm a physical oceanographer, and I know how ocean currents are formed under the influence of, radiation, wind, and topography, and how they form gyres. And also in the mother nature, there are ways of self-organizing. And if you understand how it works, then you have a handle. And immediately in 1995, when the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, which I head now, understood what was happening as a revolution in understanding of marine life, embarked on this. Now we work with the Global Environmental Facility, UNDP, as an executing agency, trying to provide training and platform for everyone to work together on this subject. So, and indeed, because this was a very promising domain, what happened was that everyone embarked on this. And now we have fisheries in large marine ecosystems. We have, all the people that look into the pollution and governance of ecosystems, those who look into different aspects of the ecosystems. In order to manage this, we have to address this in their totality. And I think now this takes me to the idea of the decade of ocean science for sustainable development. Science, ocean, large marine ecosystems, and ocean in general are very, very much science intensive. They are not transparent to radio waves. The observations in the ocean are done very much in the favor of the climate research of various marine meteorological services. We are lagging on biological, ecological observations. We are lagging on using the understanding of climate change for management of large marine ecosystems. So, basically marine science requires a major, major upgrade. And the IUC of UNESCO came up with the proposal to United Nations to conduct a United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And every word in this title matters. So focus on science, but on the delivery of science, because science has been able largely to sound alarm, but now we have to provide solutions and engage everyone into moving towards such solutions. So I would like to call on this large marine ecosystems community to engage in the decade. First of all, this is probably the largest environmental campaign in the history of environmental science, but not only environmental science, because management of large marine ecosystems is also a way of engaging social aspects and social science into this. And if we join forces between social sciences, addressing human issues and addressing also a lot of environmental issues, this is promising, because ocean, according to the World Ocean Assessment published in 2016, is in such danger that humankind is running out of time to manage the ocean sustainably. And now we have a chance to engage everyone, to have much better and more sustainable funding, to unite forces, to create a database that would be a distributed open source database uniting all the sources of knowledge in the ocean, and to move forward towards sustainable management. And Barry, yourself, you said that we need to manage and protect the large marine ecosystems. So this gives us a chance to engage the potential of science to do this in a very efficient way, to understand where the sensitive areas, how to manage the sensitive areas, how to bridge such things like coastal zone management, like marine special planning, marine protected areas, to supplement science to the newly emerging law that is under Convention of Law of the Sea on conservation and sustainable use of marine life beyond areas of natural jurisdiction. So I think now there is a very interesting and important moment in science when the science of oceanography is moving out of the domain of curiosity and moving forward towards implementing, I would say, is extensively important matters, also keeping the ocean running for the health of humanity and the sustainability and well-being for everyone. It has to be a harmonious relation between humans and the ocean. This is what we're trying to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you, Vladimir. I really, really appreciate that. And I think we can't underestimate the importance of science and making sure that that science is delivered in a way that the leadership that we need, the political, will use it. Sandra, welcome your remarks.
Thank you. One moment.
We see it.
Thank you. I'd like to actually start by putting a personal thank you to Dr. Sherman, who, these are going by themselves, who served on my dissertation committee in the 80s and inspired me to actually study ecosystems. So thank you. As Barry's already said, you know, our oceans are becoming much more used by numerous users and also strained by external factors such as climate change. So now more than ever, we need to look at sustainable use and conservation together. I like to think about this with respect to the goals being sustainable development and conservation, IOM being the process to achieve those goals, and ocean planning really as the tool that we need to use. Some of the key components of ocean planning, of course, are coordination among various regulatory agencies. Stakeholder engagement must be robust and also the cornerstone of ocean planning, as well as needing to get stakeholders to bring some of their data to the table. And of course, the foundation of ocean planning is that it must be science-based, using the most robust science. And of course, we'll be talking more during today's session about the need for science. Today, in terms of trying to address IOM and how it's been used for sustainable use and conservation, I thought it would be best to actually just give two examples here in New England of how we've used it in management to site our first wind farm, as well as our first aquaculture farm in New England waters. So let's start with the Block Island Wind Farm. They sought their first permit in 2012, and they did it within the context of the Rhode Island Special Area Management Plan. Shown, this is the area that had the specific goals of development and conservation. Some of the data overlays, of which there are literally thousands, are going to be shown in the next few slides. And on the right-hand side of each slide, I've shown which stakeholder was key in terms of either providing data or ground truthing it, because I think we always need to keep the stakeholders in mind. So Deepwater helped with some of the wind speed data. We have a lot of glacial moraine that URI had good information that they provided. And bottom type, of course, is important if you're siting a wind farm. We have vibrant commercial ship traffic area, and Moran Shipping helped a lot with that data. We have a lot of different fishing types in Rhode Island. We have trawlers shown here. We have a lot of fixed gear, which are mostly lobster pots. And we also have a very active recreational fishing industry. In fact, if you look just at the various types of fishing activities, you could say, oh my gosh, there's no place to put anything else. And that's why this whole idea of trade-offs as part of the planning process starts coming in. If we look at several other types of recreational activity, we have dive clubs that dive on wrecks offshore. And of course, we have a myriad of ecological resources, diving duck habitat just being one of them, which was important to NGOs like the Audubon Society. The result of the plan was that almost half of the total area in the planning area was actually protected from heavy industrial development, which was important to organizations like Save the Bay and Clean Ocean Access and many others. The other result of the plan was with respect to wind development. We're going to zoom into this area off of Block Island, where a renewable energy area was actually designated. Within that, the wind farm was proposed, and ultimately where the first 5 turbines in all of US waters became operational in 2016. So I think it's a clear example, and we'll probably hear more in an upcoming session from Jeff Grabowski, former CEO of Deepwater Wind, about how important the planning process was to this becoming a reality. The second example I just want to touch upon is for an aquaculture site. This was really just a pilot level project, but they put their permits in 2013. We're now zooming out to the entire Northeast region and going to look at this spot northeast of Boston, where the site was originally proposed. If we zoom in, we are in federal waters off of Cape Ann, the purple dot being the proposed site. So let's look at some of the other data overlays. Well, there's a national marine sanctuary there that CLF is very concerned about. There are transatlantic cables that zigzag through the area and need to be avoided. There's things like torpedo testing sites, obviously need to avoid those. We also have quite a bit of commercial fishing activity. These are scallop dredgers, very lucrative industry to the region. We have longline activity, mostly fishing for haddock. And ports like Boston have a lot of vessel transit that goes in and out of that port. So I think just from these few data overlays, you can see how we use science to try to avoid conflicts with other uses and ecological resources. And by doing this, we can actually get to a small aquaculture facility that is actually operational. So I do believe that ocean planning is a good tool for doing IOM in order to achieve both sustainable development and conservation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. That was great, and love to see those domestic examples. Now we're going to turn to Elin. Probably will take us to a more international frame. Elin?
Hello. I don't know if I should say good morning or good evening or good afternoon. So I'm just saying hello, everybody.
Sandra,
Thank you for.
Yes.
Sandra, if I get you to stop sharing, and then I will.
I'll just continue, and we'll see when the presentation hops on, JP.
Yeah, I need to.
Yeah.
Thanks.
There we go.
Sorry,
Sorry, got
there you go. Go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. Go ahead, Elin.
Okay. So anyway, I'm Elin Turrell, and as JP or Barry mentioned already, I'm the Director for International Programs at the Coastal Resources Center, and I'm also a researcher focusing mostly on social science. So I was really happy to hear Vladimir say that social science, and I'm very interested in integrated science, how we integrate between the natural and the human systems. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we apply a nested governance approach for integrated coastal management. Next, JP. So the Coastal Resources Center really works at the nexus between humans and the oceans. And we're very interested in helping communities find science-based solutions to address coastlines at risks and seafood that's becoming more scarce. We work on very applied science, addressing direct problems that people living in coastal areas are interested in. Next. We've been working in Rhode Island for many, many years now. I think we're coming up on our, well, I don't know, about 50th anniversary, I believe, very soon. And so we started in the early 1970s, and I saw Don Robidoux on the call. He was one of the first people who started CRC. We've worked in Rhode Island ever since we started, and it's always been our living laboratory. We're very active working on some of the issues that Sandra mentioned, and we work across the world. Right now, our biggest programs are in the Philippines, Ghana, Malawi, Madagascar, and Central America. Next. So in all the places where we work, we use a nested governance approach where we combine working at a national level, developing documents like these Indonesian documents we see here, spatial planning, policies, tools, and so forth, with the goal of then applying these at a local level. So for us, that is the real importance, is to combine the national tools and approaches with the local level on the ground action. Next. So on the ground, we really try to take a very integrated approach. So as you see on these photos, of course, we work on the natural resources, whether it's fish or turtles or bivalves or associated ecosystems like mangroves, coral reefs, and so forth. Next. But we also work on issues such as gender, livelihoods, or even child trafficking, child labor. Next. We care about people's lives, whether it's water and sanitation or healthcare. So I feel that as we start the Ocean Science Decade, it will be really important that we also apply some of the science to understanding all of these linkages, both the linkages between people's lives and the ocean and the nested systems. How does the local inform the national, or the national inform and influence the local? Thank you.
Thank you, Elin. That was great, and I think we're all fully cognizant of the importance of the social sciences and taking an integrated approach and linking the natural and the social and the physical. I think it's one of the things that's been missing over time. Hopefully, we have Ken on the line now, John. And Ken,
yes, I'm here.
Oh, great. Before I turn it over to you, I'm not sure if you were on, but I just think that those of us on the panel want to thank you for, and those on the phone, for your leadership, for your vision back in the 1980s of creating LMEs and thinking about working at this ecological scale and persisting. And when we get out of quarantine, we're all looking forward to visiting with you and having a vodka to celebrate what you've built and what we carry forward over the next few decades. So let me turn it over to you now to frame LMEs.
I'll just jump in, Ken, before you start and just say your slides are up and we're ready, and we found you out of the over 175 people. We tracked down your numbers, so welcome to have you. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you for discovering me here. I'm very pleased to join with this webinar and join with the speakers in focusing on an integrated social science and natural science approach to sustainable development. So on the first slide, I've just prepared a projection of the present number of LMEs. There are 66 around the globe, and their boundaries are determined on the basis of bathymetry, hydrography, productivity, and trophic linkages. So they're wholly based on the application of ecosystem science. On the next slide, I tried to illustrate the importance of the location of the LMEs at the boundaries of the continents, where I use a coastal zone color scanner image of an annual production cycle of grams of carbon per meter square per year. And you can see from the slide that the areas shaded in reds and oranges are around the margins of the continents. And I've outlined the LMEs as the areas with the spatial dimension of the highest levels of productivity on the globe. In relationship to marine fisheries, each year they're producing about 80% of the marine catch. And in addition, recent studies have indicated that they're contributing $27.7 trillion annually in ecosystem services to the global economy. Now, on the science basis, in this next slide, I've simply illustrated the umbrella of science, where we develop suites of indicators dealing with the linkage between natural science and social science. So the first three modules consist of metrics having to do with actual measurements of productivity in grams of carbon per meter square per year, and fish and fisheries in terms of biomass and species abundance, pollution and ecosystem health. So those are driven by natural science metrics. And they're linked to two other modules that are social science driven in terms of metrics, socioeconomic benefits from healthy LMEs, and governance mechanisms for moving forward towards sustainable development. So on this next slide, I simply wanted to emphasize the very strong scientific basis for the LME approach. And I'm simply listing the fact that there are 18 LME volumes, and they've been published by American Association for the Advancement of Science, Blackwell Science, Elsevier Science, and over 390 journal articles contributed by over 450 scientists and resource managers. So since the mid-'80s, there's been a very strong scientific basis to the ecosystem approach. Another aspect that I want to call your attention to is while we were moving the concept forward globally, the United Nations was also paying great attention at the highest political levels to environmental degradation. And the UN convened three important events, beginning in 1992 with the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, and then 10 years later followed up with the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, and then 10 years after that, they follow up on the original Rio Conference, back in Rio, referred to as Rio +20 in 2012. And the latter two of the conferences actually zeroed in on the importance of an ecosystem-based approach for sustainable development of the oceans. And then more recently in 2015, the UN, with its sustainable development goals, included the oceans as SDG 14 with specific targets relating to ecosystem-based management. Now, in the next slide, I simply wanted to call your attention to the Global Environment Facility. as being established as a direct outcome of the UNCED 1992 meeting, where funds were available through trust funds and administered through the Global Environment Facility, which is physically located within the World Bank in Washington, D.C., with the explicit focus on providing financial assistance to developing countries, providing them with an opportunity to participate in improving environmental conditions by mitigating stresses on international waters. And in 1995, the GEF operational guidelines actually supported the LME approach as a focus on spatial domains for advancing towards ecosystem-based assessment and management. And that included applications around the globe of the 5-modular approach. However, this was a game-changing event in that we were able to move from theory to practice with the GEF providing, since 1995 through 2014, a unprecedented amount of funding, $3.15 billion in catalytical funding, which involved co-financing as well as grants. And from 2014 to 2018, an additional $2.86 billion. So there's just over $6 billion in catalytic financing that has made the developing countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Eastern Europe players, participants in addressing means and methods for reducing stress on large marine ecosystems. And in order to get this done, on slide 8, I've listed the partners that have been engaged in this work with the GEF and 5 UN agencies operating as either executing or implementing agencies with the participating countries. And I now want to simply indicate that in addition to the UN, there have been active participants by NGOs and individual organizations in different countries, namely Norway, Sweden, Germany, and NOAA in the U.S. The most important contribution, and one that's very significant, is the introduction by the GEF of the 2 processes that are linked: transboundary diagnostic analyses leading to a strategic action plan. Now, this is revolutionary, providing funds to participating countries to actually generate a bottom-up approach for prioritizing stresses on the environment within the framework of the LME and prioritizing the approach. Given a successful TDA and its review at the GEF level, countries are then invited to submit a strategic action plan over a 5-year period to actually achieve the priority objectives for mitigation. And this has really been a game changer. The next slide, slide 10 on my list here, depicts the global dimension of present coverage with GEF-supported projects with 110 participating countries, and the movement towards EBM, both in the planning and implementation. And this is where the fusion takes place between the science under the umbrella of productivity, fisheries, pollution, ecosystem health, socioeconomics, and governance, on up to actual new mechanisms, governance mechanisms for moving towards sustainable development. And in the next slide, I've depicted a signing ceremony between the Republic of China and the Republic of Korea, signing their strategic action plan for 5 years for joint assessment of the Yellow Sea large marine ecosystem. And they're now in a new phase of their collaboration for the next 5 years to actually establish a commission for sustainable development jointly for the Yellow Sea LME and its goods and services. And in the next slide, over on the other side of the world, 3 countries, Namibia, South Africa, and Angola, sharing the goods and services of the Benguela Current LME, have gone even further in establishing a convention for the Benguela Current and also a commission to oversee the sustainable development of that LME, bringing full cycle the science and its application to mitigation, and that mitigation being overseen with the actual commission or convention, thus bringing full circle the political will and science in the sort of effort described earlier by Barry Gold in a much more integrated approach to the kinds of objectives that are targets for the Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 14. And the final slide is simply a cover of a 20-page booklet prepared by I.W. Learn, located at IOC UNESCO for coordinating activities for international water GEF projects. And in this booklet, there are actual examples of movement toward the specific targets of SDG 14. And with that, I just leave you with this framing of the importance of scaling from the local science through the science dealing with entire LMEs as being subject for strengthening in this upcoming decade of ocean science in support of sustainable development. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ken. That was really, really great. I think we're all applauding both your presentation and the 3 decades plus of work that you've done to lead on this. I have to say, listening to all the panels, it's at a time when hope is hard to find. It's really hopeful to hear everything that people are doing and all of the work and activity that's taking place in the ocean space that makes me feel like maybe we can take on the challenge of the coming decades. Peter, I wonder if you could start by maybe outlining 2 or 3 specific challenges that you see to achieving SDG 14 in the next decade.
Can you hear me there? Yeah. Great. Well, thanks for that. I think you wanted a 3-minute blast on this. I guess I see 2 big challenges. And LME has a part to play, of course, in both of them. The first one that I'd say is that we've got to honor the agreements we've made. We have a plan for, let's say, the survival of humankind on this planet, and it's the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. This is what we all agreed to in 2015. universal agreement. So we've got to stick to that plan. Otherwise, we're really putting our children and grandchildren in jeopardy. And by now, we all know that. We've seen the vast wildfires. We've seen the changing ocean currents. We've seen the desertification, the droughts, think of that super cyclone going up the Bay of Bengal now, those poor people. This is just proliferation of these superstorms. Everything that was predicted by science is happening now in the 21st century. And pandemics. And we are going to see more and more of these Malthusian outcomes unless we honor our agreement of 2015, which is implementing the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. So that's the task at hand. And, I believe that we will achieve that. Why? Because humanity leans in the direction of self-preservation eventually. Work at hand for all of us. That would be one. The second that I would say, in terms of what are our impediments on implementing SDG 14, I would say that this pandemic could lead us, if we're not careful, into taking us back to where we were. When you think of the terrible plastic pollution which we were witnessing and still are witnessing, when you think of the subsidized fossil fuels, subsidized global fishing fleets, all of these with incredible detriment that we could see from them, but we're not prepared to abolish these things. So there's a danger that we return to that gray old world, which will just bring us back to the tunnel through which we have been traveling these last few months. And we don't want to return to that, obviously, because we care about our children and grandchildren's future. So what does that mean? It means that we've got to set out on this blue-green recovery that we've been talking about. And we have this opportunity out of this crisis to do so. And this is not just sort of fairy tale stuff. This is the time that decisions are being made on huge capital investment plans by all the regional banks and the global banks and the governments and so on. They're all setting their seal now to how the money will be spent to recover over the next decade or so. Now, the winners in this, well, first of all, the winners will be humanity if everybody gets on board with a blue-green recovery. But the countries that do proceed on a blue-green recovery, in other words, investing into a clean transition out of the old gray industries into a future of green hydrogen, of offshore renewable energy, of sustainable aquaculture, and all these things that are very, very doable. If the decisions are made now to put the funds we have available into that blue-green recovery, then we're going to come out of this much better off than we were before we went into this pandemic. But that's an if, and it requires all of us that have the influence to do so, and that goes right down to your town hall meetings to be pushing that point very strongly. I think that's my 3 minutes there, Barry.
Thank you, Peter. I think that is really a timely message for all of us. I know here in the U.S., as we start to think about what the next stimulus is, it's a focus on jobs, economic development in a way that does not lock in the past, but actually promotes a future, the one that you described. Vladimir, I wonder if you could sort of share with us 2 critical objectives for the decade and key challenges to success that you see from the science perspective or beyond.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Barry. The decade, as I already said, is going to be a historic and very large undertaking. So I don't know if the audience already have seen the logo of the decade. So it's like a wave that is helping all the logos of the sustainable development to move forward. But for me, this is also looking like a snowball, and we are trying to manage something that is really very, very big. So with a lot of societal interest in applications and engaging the society. I saw some questions about omics, about different deliverables. So for us, the most important thing is to mainstream ocean science and to start making sense based on the scientific approach in terms of protection of the ocean and in terms of all the things that Peter Thompson mentioned just before me. So if the science is actually making the world and the things much more transparent, if we observe in a standard way, if we communicate what is happening, then I think people will understand the current situation, the path for sustainability. So for us, the most important thing is to provide a good framework for consolidating the work of everyone on that direction. And of course, also to move towards science. That will be the science of observation, analysis, prediction. And the main paradigm here is very, very simple. We need to move from the current state of the ocean to a managed state of the ocean. Integrated ocean management is the key word there. And we can implement this through, as I already said, coastal zone management, maritime special planning, marine protected areas, and large marine ecosystems provide a fantastic tool for that. I would like also to call on the LME community, large marine ecosystems community, to be more looking into predictions of the future. Because, you know, if we combine the science of climate, the science of biodiversity into modeling context, then we will be able to predict and manage the ocean. So I would say that observations and management and bringing this into the domain of social applications, that is making things convincing and moving towards action to sustain the ocean. That's the paradigm, science and action. Thank you.
Vladimir, can I jump in on that and just ask a follow-up related question? Is how do you see social science feeding into this process? Many times when people hear science, they're thinking natural science, measurements of oceanographic processes. Can you expand upon sort of the role of social science in this broader question and issue?
John, thank you. You know, you're asking a person who is a physical scientist and climatologist. But, you know, I would like to state that the design over the decade is an example of a huge attempt in the social domain, because we more or less know what needs to be done in kind of environmental sciences. But to give it the social strengths is exactly the challenge that we are grappling with. So, and this we do this by involving managers, business, philanthropists, communication, and also social sciences and regional knowledge. So I would like to state that it's not a typical social science application that will be, you know, studying certain psychological aspects and things like this. But but I would state that in the result of the lack of action in 2009, after the Conference of Parties on Climate Change in Copenhagen, when the old science, the natural science was there, but there was no action, people that even were involved in the climate science started to embark on trying to understand how we can set this world in motion. And that is exactly the social science. That involves communication, that involves you know, ways of understanding how people react, you know, what makes them react. You know, if you see a car that is going around you over, you're going to jump off the way. If your mother tells you that you know, you stop smoking, it's dangerous for health, you won't stop smoking. So there are some ways, and you know, and for us this is not yet a done deal. I think we're embarking on a big societal exercise that is aimed to promote science, but we haven't solved it. But you know, we already understand the complexity, and we have on board social sciences that are helping us to promote the message. And the main task for the social sciences is to engage the potential of natural sciences into the positive action of the society, and that is how the social sciences will involve. And you know, because without them, it is just useless, because it will be, we will learn more, but no one is going to react on that. So that's the paradigm we're trying to change.
Great, thanks, Vladimir. I think you're exactly right. And interesting, you've touched on a few things. You know, it's interesting to note that you mentioned integrated ocean management, and while we're on this webinar, there's another webinar from the high-level ocean panel this morning on integrated ocean management. So there's convergence around communities. I also think the issue of engagement, and when we say science, we need to recognize going forward that we're talking about the natural and social sciences every time we say science, and not just the physical and natural sciences, where we've been historically in the oceans. I think the other thing is the importance of communication and engagement that you touched on. We're not going to make progress if we just talk within this community, but we have to engage the local communities and the broader society in understanding. And Sandra, I wonder if you might talk about what you see as the key role of NGOs versus governments, industry, academia, and communities in building linkages so that we can make this kind of progress.
Well, thank you, Barry. I do see organizations like Ocean Conservancy as an NGO as really being critical as an advocacy organization for two things. One, to make sure that conservation is always retained as a top priority during these LME ecosystem-based management processes, but also to make sure that the process itself is really robust and is done with the best available science and with the maximum stakeholder engagement possible. And it's been interesting to see in the last decade how Ocean Conservancy has really become a connector for a number of stakeholders into these planning processes. You know, some of these stakeholders are like, you know, small aquaculture or operations. They don't necessarily have time to go to every single planning meeting. So I think it's an important role for the NGO community to help connect those voices to the overall processes. And then with respect to linkages, I think it's important that NGOs really advocate in the next decade for two things. One, that any regional planning entity that is not already solidly codified into law become so. Here in the United States, our regional planning bodies are somewhat voluntary, but only really stood up through executive order. We'd like to see federal legislation passed to make sure that they're truly durable. And then I can only just echo what other people have said, which is that to make sure that there's adequate funding for the necessary science, to make sure it's current and comprehensive, to be able to really do this work in a sound way. And of course, that's more important now than ever because of the dramatic changes we're seeing in the ecosystem due to climate. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sandra. Elin, I wonder, this is the area where you work a lot. I wonder if you might talk and build on sort of the importance of engaging communities, especially you work across so many regions and geographies of the world. What's common, what's different, where do you see the challenges, and how do we move forward?
Well, I feel like the way we are successful in engaging communities is to find good local partners everywhere, whether they are local universities or local NGOs, the national government, national extension people. So I think in each place is unique, but say in Ghana, for example, we work with both the University of Cape Coast, we work with the local women-oriented NGOs like Sewifia and Development Alternative Associates, I think they're called, DA. And we're really behind the scenes. We're never front and center. And I think that's how we operate in Rhode Island too. We facilitate, we try, we help out with tools and all the things I mentioned before, but the people that are then connecting with the people on the ground are the locals. So I think that's what we do everywhere. So I'm not sure I can tell you that it's unique from place to place, because I feel like we kind of have that approach everywhere.
No, that's great. Ken, so over the trajectory, when you started in the 80s, it started really with ecological science, and you've grown it to bring in the 5 modules, and you've built in the social science. And we're at this point in this next decade or two of really trying to sort of make it happen on the ground in a broader scale. I just wonder your reflections on how we use the science, the LME science, to encourage better management, and how we build going forward.
Yes, well, thank you for that, Barry. I look at the umbrella of science where in the LME network, it's been possible over the years for countries at the ministerial level to come to agreement on prioritizing stresses on their large, shared resources of a large marine ecosystem, and have been applying science not in the research dimension, which is outside the funding realm of a number of international financial organizations and the GEF in particular, but they are able to support assessments. That is, taking science off the shelf that has application to reduction of stress on the environment, either the natural stress or the human-induced stresses. And to make this point, we looked at the literature of the LMEs since the mid-'80s in terms of publications that have already been through peer review, and made a selection of 50 of the best of those through a panel selection process, and bringing those out over the next month in a publication of best practices, that is in the application of cutting-edge science, right at the very edge of looking forward. Vladimir indicated that we ought to be forecasting a bit more, and a number of the selections are looking to 2030, 2050, 2060 in terms of modeling both the biological and social sciences. And those papers are now ready to be produced in an e-book. All the copyright releases have been obtained. And in a number of them, they are at the very cutting edge of science. And they're based on papers that are actually published in Science or the Proceedings of the National Academy or in Nature. And I believe that they will have a very important role in the decade. So in order to bring them around to the community, we've developed a portfolio, an electronic portfolio, and the centerpiece of the portfolio is this volume of cutting-edge science. And in one of the papers, very upbeat, written by some very good people appearing in the Proceedings of the National Academy, there are forecasts for fisheries, for example, in which there is ample protein being produced at the basic productivity level for the anticipated population expansions of the future. And there are a number of very encouraging forward-looking papers that we hope we can make available to the broader scientific community, management community, and more importantly, the public at large. And in the same vein, we've developed a 6-week course with the University of Cape Town on assessment and management of large marine ecosystems. So we're looking forward to disseminating the results of the application of science that are pointing to a positive future for, say, protein production in the ocean, as an example. And I think I'll leave it at that for the time being.
Great. You know, I want to give the panelists a chance to make any other additional remarks or thoughts triggered by what you've heard in response to the questions from others. And why don't we start with Peter? Had to leave us, but why don't we start with Vladimir?
You know, I also try to watch. Thank you very much, Barry. I'm trying to also look at the questions, and there are many questions coming about the specifics. But I try to be, kind of embrace the complexity of the whole thing. But one of the questions resonated with me, and actually two. They were coming, I think, from India and from Africa. The capacity for solutions is totally different in the world. So I think it is very important to realize that there must be a capacity development and education and ocean literacy component that engages the society, that also leads to transfer of marine technology, which we understand that everything that is applicable for ocean science. So we have to develop the capacity in two things: the cutting edge of science. So, what is happening now in India? I think what is happening in India is quite important in the sense that, previously there was a tropical cyclone, and India was able to significantly reduce the number of people who suffered from the tropical cyclone. Now there is another tropical cyclone, and there is also evacuation of 1,100,000 people there. So, there is action. And I think it wouldn't be imaginable like 10 years ago. So there is a huge progress in this. So, but for us to develop the predictive capacity is one thing, but to also, engage governments into science-based action is equally important, because, there is always the problem of the last mile. Now, when it comes to most tsunamis that are not near field or not related to our seismic sources, we can warn about the tsunami. And then, but if the governments react, if the last mile has been passed, that is a big deal. So indeed, we are not speaking about the science for the sake of curiosity, as I said, as a science, but the science that is intended to support sustainable development. That means actionable science. And that is also an additional layer of complexity, but also this is an additional layer of developing something that's attractive to everyone who understands that we need now the science. This is a world in which it was possible to use, I would say, force in the previous centuries to solve your own problem, but now we are all in one boat, and science is the driving force for sustainability. I think this is the main message that I would like to share.
And to follow on that, Vladimir, which is a great point, one of the questions from the audience was about how do you stand on, from Vinay Krishna, was how do you stand on mitigating the imminent risk of coastal flooding? What measures do you think are going to come in the future? And I think you already alluded to that in the answer, is that science plays a vital role in having modeling that can tell us about where the threats are. But I think you also alluded to one of the greatest challenges, which is that last mile. How do we get that information, in some cases, very technical information, to the public, and to get them to hear it and respond? Just like we're having challenges today with the COVID-19 crisis, science is not always heard, or in some cases, when there's false alarms, there's misinformation. Maybe do any of the panelists want to speak to those challenges? Tough one. Sandra,
yeah, I just might add that we're now in a position to bring forward this cutting-edge science that is available to be applied to mitigation of stresses within the spatial domain of LMEs. And I believe that we're in a position to prepare a portfolio that contains that kind of information to make it available to a much broader audience within the LME network and beyond the LME network, there are about 8 products that could serve in this portfolio as outreach of the examples of science in supporting sustainable development of the oceans. So that that's simply one activity that we intend to follow through on over the next several months, and that includes that self-learning course that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, Sandra, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to build on what Vladimir has just said, as well as Ken, which is that I think we really need to keep in mind the importance of capacity building for countries to really be able to collect their own critical science and meet those needs. One of the countries that I'm working with to develop an ocean plan so that they can manage their emerging blue economy is Timor-Leste. And they're a small country, they're a developing country, and they're a good example of not having currently the capacity to have scientists to go out and collect that information. So making sure that in addition to having some international NGOs or scientific communities come in and get some of the basic science collected, we want to make sure that we are helping them enhance their capacity to do it themselves.
Great. Thanks, Sandra. I wonder, we're also privileged to have Julianne Barbier on the phone, who is the head of marine policy and regional coordination at UNESCO IOC and the focal point for the UN decade. Julianne, I wonder if you might want to chime in here and say a few things.
Thank you, Barry, and hello, dear colleagues. Very happy to be online with all our good friends from the LME community. I just want to pick up on one question I saw in the Q&A, and it's really how do we ensure that the science we are developing is really transferable and usable in different regional and socioeconomic contexts. And I think that that's, of course, a key challenge that we have, having a north and south divide. In the context of a decade, we are developing an implementation plan which provides very much a high-level framework for achieving those big global deliverables that we need to improve, whether it's a better understanding of the impacts of cumulative stresses on the ocean ecosystems, a better ocean observation system, or an ecosystem, a digital ecosystem that allows exchange and open access to data. But of course, it's important that we translate those to the needs of specific regions. In the last 9 months, we have organized 12 regional workshops to set up those discussions at the regional level in all ocean basins and trying to bring all those stakeholders at the table. So our vision is very much that this has to be self-driven, but we hope that the added value and the value proposition of a decade, that it will provide a framework for investing collectively in those priority areas that each region is identifying and linking those to the policy and the sustainable development dimension. We believe that's really how we can really ensure a true impact of this decade by 2030.
That's great. Elin, do you have any comments before I have another thing, but before we get off this topic?
Well,
yes.
maybe building on what Julian was saying, I feel like one issue we're grappling with here is scale, because we talk about the ocean sciences decade. We talk about sort of understanding the ocean, saving the ocean, but the ocean, just like land, is a very complex space, and people care mostly about the ocean and the space that's closest to them. So I think, as I said in the beginning, that's why we sort of have this nested scale where we work from local and then up to national. But I think the LME approach has, I applaud the LMEs for having tried to manage the ocean in a at a scale that's that goes beyond national and really looks at the ecosystem scale. And I don't have any solutions to that more than really taking what we learn from local level and sort of using a learning approach, whether it's country learning or cross-topic learning, and bringing things from local up to national and even the sort of the international scale. So I think that's going to be a real challenge for us as we enter this decade.
John, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in, and it builds off Elon's comments and really gets back to that question that Julian raised. That question was asked by Vera Agostini from FAO, which was, how do we ensure that the decade remains a focus on the kind of science that will need to be realistic, that will help really essentially make impact? And I think at the end of the day, connecting to people is critical, and that's where I think Elon was alluding to that. And we've talked a lot about science, and as we've said, science, as a scientist, as an oceanographer, I always enjoy learning and hearing about science. But I do think what probably means the most to people is what's happening, as Elon put it, closest to them, maybe what they are most familiar with, whether it's their beaches or their community and the resources that they rely on. And so I think finding a way to really speak, science doesn't always speak to people. And in many cases, it's those activities, the ways they engage the sea, whether it's directly for economic benefit, or if it's indirectly for recreational or other benefits, just enjoyment. So thinking about that and how we make those linkages between science and then sort of the practical, what means something to so many people, I think is something we need to think about. I wanted to circle back to another question that was raised by Mark Capron from Ocean Forester. And this, bringing you back into the conversation, Vladimir or Julian, he was asking about how broad are the deliverables of the decade, and you alluded to a few. Specifically, he was wondering about how specific can we get, or should we get? I think you alluded to that there's local, we have to apply the questions to the local communities, but maybe could you add how specific are you thinking when we start talking about the ocean decade and applying it?
And now we have a problem with Julian, because we don't know who should answer. And both know an answer, but they may be two different answers.
You start, and then I'll contradict you.
Okay. All right. Okay. So then, first of all, the most important thing that the decade provides a global framework for actions. So global approach. That means global means not that it is too high level. Global means basically everywhere. So that is, I think, that dimension that we need to develop, so we can share global climate predictions. They have to be then downscaled to the local areas. And of course, the solutions are always local when it comes to issues related not to climate, because for climate, we have global problems. And indeed, there is now huge progress of science. And I think the same person asked about omics. And I think what is happening now in biological and ecological sciences is that we can go to a totally different level of understanding the ecosystems through whole trophical change. And we can do this also with high-level inputs from models of the Earth system. So I think basically the idea would be that we can have a global approach that provides global information that is translated to regional level and local level, and then with communication, we'll be able to trigger action at the local scale. Beach cleanup is a simple thing, but when it comes to, for example, harmful algal bloom, then this requires already a prediction system. when it comes to sargasso in the Caribbean area, that is also requires a lot of predictive skill. So the idea is to enable people working at the local level and on quite specific things to have a good approach that will be facilitated by science. So I think at all scales, and that's exactly what is a complicated thing. It's a huge thing. So we need to find entry points to make this ball rolling. Julian, now contradict me, please.
No, not this time. I will only complement, just to explain the process of a decade itself as well. As Vladimir mentioned, we are basically framing a high-level plan to trigger action. And this plan will have elements related to the criteria of the actions that we want to promote. And in there, this whole idea of transformation is very important. Transformation in the way we are organizing the science, the way we are engaging with end users in co-designing and co-delivering the science, and the way we are really communicating the output of this research. But the actions still need to be designed and put forward. So I also want to highlight that towards the end of this year, we will basically, as the decade will start in 2021, and we will have the plan presented to the United General Assembly. The next phase is really about communities moving forwards and proposing actions for the decade, so that we can, collectively get those efforts to basically help us achieve those global objectives that have been presented.
Julian, may I ask you also to develop a little bit your response in terms of the hierarchy of actions from programs to
yes.
That I think it's very relevant.
So again, recognizing that there are a number of deliverables that needs to be achieved through international collaboration. For example, if we are talking about completing a high resolution map of the ocean, clearly that requires having a mechanism for nations around the world to work together. So there are the kind of high level programs that we are thinking about and we hope to see emerging, which will really bring this collaboration together. Then we will have also projects which are maybe more narrow focused and maybe specifically addressing one or two objectives of a decade implementation plan. And then we also have a national action, and it's very important that, for example, this dialogue between science and stakeholders working in different sectors get together also to trigger and promote action at the national level. So we are proposing, for example, establishment of national committees to do that. And then finally, I just want to highlight that we also need to recognize the contributions of countries. Many countries have a capacity in terms of ship time, in terms of access to infrastructure, in terms of training, and we know that there are countries who are ready to make those facilities and those contributions available to the international community. So it would be important to also frame that within the decade.
Maybe I'll jump in with one related question came in from Tania Norori, which she asked about would the panelists consider that maintaining open webinars like this to attract more stakeholders and listeners to ocean topics, would that be a possibility? Also, it limits international travel and so on, which is a good thing too. But any thoughts on the outreach mechanisms?
Can I jump in on that?
Please, Sandra,
yeah, I would say absolutely. And not knowing who all of our 193 participants were, I think it's really going to be important that we try to bring more political leaders or their staff to these webinars, because in fact, one of the questions that came up was how do we maintain the political commitment to this? And I think having them become more aware of the science that is so necessary and the interest will be helpful in terms of making this durable past 2030.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think, doing this is a great idea. And John, maybe it's a challenge for CSO to think about how to facilitate more of these along with UNESCO. But I also think in addition to political leadership, we need to bring the industry participants in, right? So one of the things that we're seeing is, oftentimes now when we go to countries, we're talking to ministers of finance, not just ministers of environment, as we look towards the blue economy, and they're looking at investment, right? And starting to recognize that the only benefit they get is if they maintain a healthy ocean ecosystem for the things that they want. And then industry, as Sandra's examples have shown, are trying to figure out how to partner. So we are at a new time where we have to think about how to bring all of these partners together. And maybe webinars would be an interesting way to do that.
And to build off that comment, one of our folks at the Coastal Resources Center, Jen McCann, wrote in about economic data. So bringing in industry is important. I think also, economics speaks to a lot of people as well. Of course, as we've heard throughout this, the blue economy is moving to the forefront. But I think this is a great way to make a case for conservation and also to think about how we weigh options. Use of the sea, as Sandra pointed out, we need to be considering economic data, which is part of the social data, but I wanted to bring that in. That was a good comment. Any other? I can pull another one from the crowd. I want to bring Katie McConnell wrote in. She's working on a operations manual for Micronesia's protected areas framework, and she had a question for Elin about how she would define a good local partner. I think maybe that was alluded to earlier. And then also, do you ever facilitate local communities in identifying their representatives? How is that process achieved when you're engaging local communities, Elin?
So when we work to develop or find local partners, usually we usually work in a place for a long time. So for a long time in our world is 10 to 20 years. So we have a network of partners, and that's who we start with. So if we know somebody in a country, we'll talk to them and see who do you think might be good, strong partners. But I guess we go around, we take some chances as well on who we should be working with. I feel like commitment and knowledge of the place would be critical. It's not critical that our local partners have perfect capacity to start with, because we can always work on strength and capacity as long as the commitment is there, and that there is a sort of a constituency, that the people who live in a place also believe in that organization. So I think that was part of the question. What was the second part?
I think maybe how you identify key representatives, local leaders, perhaps. How does that process work?
Yes, we do that in a similar way too. As I said before, we usually then work through our local partners. And honestly, I find that finding the leaders is not that hard, but sometimes it's hard to get the voice or hear from the people who are not the leaders. It's sort of what we call elite capture can be a problem, where we only hear the priorities of those that are in leadership positions. So I find it more challenging to dig deeper down.
Yeah, John, can I add in there? I think, one of the things that I've seen across the work that I've done in Indonesia, Latin America, Africa, elsewhere, is that, the importance of finding local champions and building that at the community level, but also having them embrace science and having all of us embrace science. One of the things that struck me when Sandra was talking is in the United States right now, if you talk about aquaculture, the environment community it just comes out in a knee-jerk response opposed to aquaculture development in U.S. waters, without looking at, how you can do it today, what the opportunities for mitigation are, what the needs of communities are, how we're going to balance those things. And I think that's where, coming back to science, using traditional ecological knowledge, pulling this together in a way that is robust is going to be what moves us forward. So I think it is challenging, but it's what we have to do in implementing on the ground with these broad, lessons learned from these broad global experiments will help us move forward in particular places.
Great point. Katie also had another very good question that I want to circle back to, which is for the panel, but I think mostly, she indicated mostly for Ken, is there an operations manual for integrating regional, national level natural and social data into global databases, or I would say the LME sort of framework? Ken, do you want to field that one?
Yeah, well, there is no single operations manual. There's a lot to be learned from the SAP literature and the TDA literature, which is a bottom-up approach to ecosystem-based assessment and management. And that's, for lack of a better term, that's sort of gray literature, but it's very rich in experience, and we should look at how we can make that more readily available. At the moment, they're very difficult to find on the website of the GEF or IW Learn, but I think we can work on that and tap that rich resource that's out there. The other is we've been putting together a series of regional volumes on large marine ecosystems that bring into focus the socioeconomic, natural science, social science in individual papers, usually dealing with different scales. We're presently working on a volume on African LMEs that are bringing in the 5 big economies, that is fisheries, energy, transportation, tourism, and mining. And we're finding that social scientists are contributing to those sorts of things. There's one that's already been published on Asian LMEs and another published on Latin American and Caribbean LMEs. So that's simply another example of where the different scales are coming together more or less after the fact, and at least sharing their experiences with others who have access to the special journals that are being published.
Thank you, Ken. Anyone else want to add any comment to Katie's question? And I've got another one queued up here, which is from Hani Tatwani. I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. Vice President of the Saudi Wildlife Authority in Saudi Arabia. And my question is, how can we ensure global high-level political comment to ensure that the ocean issues are high on the list of priorities for the environment, social, and economic importance of protecting the seas? That gets to the political aspect. Sandra, do you want to comment on that one?
Sure. I mean, I think just to follow up on what I said before, I think it's critical that we have the science presented in a format that is easy to digest and understand for political leaders and their staff. They're not all going to delve into the intricate tables that might be published in Science and Nature. So I guess I would say it's important that all of these major efforts have some kind of a communication strategy associated with them that will be able to make the information accessible to not only political leaders, but also members of the public and key stakeholders.
Excellent. Any other? I'm going to go to another question from Gail Scowcroft here at URI. She asks, the Global Ocean Literacy Summit is being planned for World Ocean Day in partnership with the IOC. What do you see are the top priorities that we should address at the summit to meet Ocean Decade goals, particularly, again, getting back to ocean literacy? It's a broad area. Anybody want to tackle that one? Vladimir's coming in. All right.
You know, let me just use this opportunity to thank all the listeners and those who asked questions, because I will have to have been having a need to move to another seminar for quite some time. But you know, just answering that particular question. So the ocean literacy is indeed at the you know, foundation of what we're trying to achieve. And it relates to so many questions that you already have posed. Because, you know, it is the changing minds of people. That is what we are trying to achieve. To explain to them the role of the ocean in their lives and how they can affect the ocean, and how they affect the ocean, and how they can improve the situation. This goes to school students, so people would know that more than 50% of the oxygen is generated by the phytoplankton in the ocean. So this is the most foundational thing that that we can create. So indeed, come to the Ocean Literacy Summit on the 8th of June, and there will be, I think, a huge audience. So register first, and with that, we hope also to change minds of the governments. And also responding to the previous question, governments are on board, because it was the United Nations General Assembly that adopted and the idea and proclaimed the decade of ocean science. It means that 195 governments are already agreeing that ocean is important. So we are going further, explaining to people and to governments what can be done. And on the basis of this, we hope to unroll the whole set of actions of the decade that will be affecting the society, but also engaging society in big numbers. So that's the thing that we are trying to achieve: communication and engagement of people, particularly communication of educators that will be speaking to the students at schools, and you know, trying to explain to them how they depend on the ocean and affect the ocean. So that's the idea. And I really thank you, organizers and the listeners. Now let me just switch over to another meeting, which is much more bureaucratic than yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Vladimir, and really appreciate all your comments, and good luck in your next meeting, hopefully.
Thank you.
As well. You know, one of the things I want to say, I think ocean literacy is critical, but I worry sometimes that we set literacy up as something that holds us back from making progress. I think it's something ocean literacy is no different than forest literacy or river health literacy, or we just have to recognize that, you know, we sit in a place where we do this every day, all day long, but most of society just lives in the world with some different levels of understanding. So certainly we have to do a much better job of, as Vladimir said, helping people understand the role of the oceans, the importance of the oceans, their actions. But we also can't let that lack of knowledge stop us from working and making progress. And John, there was another question about from Santiago Menescal. I apologize if I got your name wrong, about hotspots for fisheries and the challenge of governance and legal structures. And I wonder if anyone wants to respond to that. You know, we have a lot out there, but certainly monitoring and enforcement is a challenge. So how do we move forward with that? Sandra, maybe?
Thanks, Gary. Give me the hard one. Yeah, I mean, again, I think, you know, funding and is going to be critical, and capacity building. You know, I'll go back to a country like Timor-Leste, a rapidly developing country with quite large EEZ. They've had a really difficult time enforcing the fisheries management and grappling with IUU fishing. So making sure that we are not only developing the science for appropriate fisheries management, but also making sure that the science that leads to the management has some enforcement capability, because otherwise it's really a moot point.
Thanks.
Actually, I want to jump in on that one as well. Qing Chen asked about overfishing as being a serious threat to the ocean and what strategies we can take. And I wanted to bring Elin in on that because I think the nested approach is an important one here. And I know at the Coastal Resources Center with our projects, while science and enforcement are important, in many cases it's bringing the community to support those efforts, to really want to see science and management step in. Elin, you want to comment on any thoughts in that regard?
Sure. Well, I think most of the fisheries that we work with are both data poor and money poor, right? So there's very limited data and there's very little money for enforcement. So we really try to promote sort of approaches that are incentive driven more than enforcement driven, developing, as Barry was talking about, developing leadership and champions, not only at political level, but within industry, within communities, setting good examples, finding ways to for fishermen to make money with less effort. So I think it's quite complex, but yes, you need enforcement, but you also need voluntary compliance. You need leadership for good stewardship. So that's what we try to do.
Yeah,
and buy-in too from the community. Sorry.
I just want to add to that. I mean, I think, one of the themes that's coming across here in people's comments in the answers is that we need all of the above, right? It's going to be regulation, it's going to be spatial management, it's going to be incentives, it's going to be market demand. It's going to be something we haven't talked about, the role of behavioral economics and how do we change people's behaviors and incentivize that, pride campaigns and those types of things. And it's going to be messy. And I think the hopefulness is that we have over 150, we had almost 190 participants on this call. That just shows the level of engagement and commitment and expertise that's out there to make a difference. Ken, I wonder, I just have a thought. When you hosted the first seminar in 1984 on LMEs, you probably didn't expect to be here today with how it's grown. So I just wonder what your thoughts are and what the trajectory you'd like to see for the next 30 years of work in the oceans and your vision for where we might be.
Well, I have to say at approaching 88 years of age, I'm delighted to be part of this discussion. So I've seen an enormous amount of progress in places that I never would have expected it. For example, to find 3 countries, Namibia wasn't even a country until 1990 when it broke away from South Africa. Angola, a former Portuguese colony, and South Africa coming out of apartheid. To see those countries come together at a level of interaction that wasn't available before because of the lack of a means for bringing those countries together. So I see the GEF as a game changer. I would encourage countries to reinvest in the GEF. They are proponents of the bottom-up approach. The bottom-up approach brings the local, regional, national, and international scales into focus in a very positive and enlightened manner. So I would like to build on what has been proven to be a successful movement. And for lack of better terms, I'll use the GEF shorthand of the Transboundary Diagnostic Analysis and Strategic Action Planning process. I believe that's a very important component of marine spatial planning, and ought to be considered as a means for linking the scale issues. But in terms of where we were in 1984 at the first symposium, we've come quite a long way. And what's made that possible in many respects has been a recognition that there ought to be a financial institution that pays attention to developing countries around the world and provides financial support at a level that I would never have imagined back in the mid-'80s. So we're on the right path. The kinds of things that Jeff is supporting are replicable. They can be replicated around the globe, and they're scalable. They can be prepared from the local to the international level. So we have a model that's out there that seems to be working. I would hope we could pay more attention to that, and in the long run, look to Jeff to continue its good work.
Thank you, Ken. John, before I turn it back to you, I just have a few comments. Just building off of what Ken said, I've recently become involved in a new global partnership called the Blue Nature Alliance, which we're working to bring together NGOs, governments, local communities, and the private sector to help catalyze and invest in large-scale ocean conservation with a goal of getting 18 million square kilometers of new spatially managed areas in some form of protection and use. And the global environment facilities, which contributed tremendously to the advancement of the LME approach, is also a core partner in the Blue Nature Alliance. And I think what's interesting and relates to this is fundamentally, what we recognize as part of this alliance is the need for a Big Ten approach, that if we're going to reach the scale of the ocean decade and the level of protection and effective management, that we have to build partnerships amongst multiple groups. And I would say, just sort of thinking about the themes that I heard here is that, we need what I call stacked interventions. So we need to use the regulation, the incentives, the markets, the spatially explicit management. We need nested scales of looking at the ecosystem at different scales, but also looking at political and administrative jurisdictional boundaries at different scales and bringing them together. We need this approach to be science-based, both in the natural and physical sciences as well as the social sciences. It's fundamentally challenging if you walk in as a natural scientist and you try to play yourself as a social scientist. You might do that on TV, but you can't do that in the real life. And so I think the natural and physical scientists need to do a lot more in bringing the social scientists in to this work. We have to have stakeholder engagement, right? And it has to be all stakeholders, from local communities up to industry. And we've got to recognize that stakeholders have different goals, and that we've got to deliver both economic outcomes as well as ecological outcomes, and help just cement the understanding that, humans depend on the natural world. And I think that's becoming clearer to everyone. And, just going back to, I think, Peter's comment, we have to ensure that the pandemic and the sort of resetting of the global economy, we don't go back and do it in a backward-looking way, but we look forward and we help reset the global economy in a way that supports nature and makes the planet sustainable for all species, not just humans, going forward. And these kinds of meetings and the kinds of people who I've met in the work that I've done, and the people on the phone with us and the participants, give me hope that we can achieve all of that. So let me turn it back to you to wrap us up here. You're on mute.
There we go. Sorry about that. Thanks so much, Barry. In conclusion, I want to thank everyone for attending. I know you've all probably been on a lot of webinars recently, so joining us for another one, we really appreciate it. We hope that you will help us continue this conversation and join us for future Global Ocean Series sessions. I urge you to follow the website, both for information about the sessions, and several questions came in about wanting access to reports, and I'm sorry we couldn't address all the questions, but we will do our best to get our information up on the website, as well as links to other events that were mentioned. I did want to make a note that our second session, which is going to be focused on the Northeast Shelf, we are going to reschedule that to June just because we needed a little more time to work with our partners. But sessions 3 and 4 are scheduled for June 10th and 11th, and those details again are on the website. I want to say thanks to the speakers, the organizers, and the supporting organizations. In addition to the series, I hope you will engage in many of the other upcoming events, like the virtual ocean dialogues that were mentioned, and of course contribute to the Ocean Decade as we kick that off. But I know there are going to be more events through the summer and fall. So thanks again. Be well and be safe, and enjoy the ocean when you can safely. Thank you all.